Archdeacon Mary, thank you again for making the time to be with us at what I know will be both a busy and a precious time for you as you're preparing for things this coming weekend. We're going to have a conversation about life and vocation and ministry and church, if we can. And I wonder whether we can start at the very beginning. Struck that you were brought up in a vicarage, an astonishingly well-adjusted child to clerical parents, which is not always a guarantee of respectability. But Charles, your father, who I was very blessed to know in part, a Church of England parish priest, and Daphne, your wonderful mother, who will be with us on Saturday, had a scientific background. And I'm just curious, at home, that mix of influences, what was it like around the vicarage dining table with that mix of parental influences on the adolescent Mary Stallard?
Oh, thank you, Sean. It's such a privilege to be with you this evening. Thank you. Yeah, brought up in a vicarage. What was it like? Well, I think whatever we're brought up with, we feel is natural, don't we? And feel it takes a while before we realise that every home's distinctive. But mine was a really privileged home. It's great having a mum who's a scientist who likes asking questions, and that mixture of science and faith, I think, meant I was brought up in a family where one of the overwhelming messages was there's no question that you can't answer, and it's okay to have questions and have faith at the same time. In fact, it's really good. So there was a kind of continual openness in terms of encountering science and religion, questions, belief and doubt. And vicarages are great places because the whole of life surrounds you. So in a vicarage, you get used at a very early stage to meeting the whole of life, to being brought up to know that if you answer the door or the telephone, you may be talking to somebody who is upset or in need. And I think that's a very rounded way to be introduced to life. And it was a real privilege to be brought up with that mixture.
Theologically, in terms of the life of the church at that point, it was a time when things were beginning to change quite a bit in terms of patterns of worship and theological influences. What was that like for you in terms of somebody who was brought up and who became a student, a young adult in that context where there was a bit of a liberalization and a fluidity to the life of the church?
Really interesting to see that change. So to be brought up on the Book of Common Prayer, so to be brought up with very long services of the word, sometimes a very long morning prayer, and then followed by a communion straight afterwards. And then in England, they started liturgical experimentation. So the alternative service book came in, and there was a more regular pattern of Holy Communion. But that time of change meant when I went off to university, I felt very free to explore lots of different forms of worshipping life, both within Christianity and beyond. So going to Methodist services, going to Anglican services, being part of a charismatic Catholic prayer group. Also encountering Buddhism, and with all the stress of being a student, starting Buddhist meditation, led by a very good-looking Buddhist monk called Kulananda, who I remember well. And I'm sure my diligence in attending meditation wasn't entirely driven by my desire to learn more about meditation. But to experience religion, worship, practice and belief at the same time as studying theology, which was what I was doing. So opening my mind to lots of questions, but opening my heart to lots of different ways of praying. It was a tremendously rich environment to be in. And it was at university that I first encountered women who were thinking about being ordained, because I'd been brought up in a church where all the leadership was male, so it simply didn't cross my mind that women might be called to be amongst the ordained, because all I saw in front of me in church were men doing most of the leading. There was the occasional woman who was leading, but they seemed to have very small roles, and I never saw any younger women taking a lead or offering a role model. But at university, I met women who were training for Methodist leadership, for ordination in the Anglican Church, and women who were involved in theology and leadership, great role models.
You went to theological college yourself in Birmingham, which would have been in the range of theological colleges that are available to people who are ordinants, who are to be ordained in the Church of England. Is a particular choice. Colleges are quite colourful places for ordinands. What attracted you to the Queen's College in Birmingham, and what was life like there?
Well, I had met Andrew by that point, who was also exploring ordination. And actually, our first choice, because Andrew very much felt a call to ministry in the Church of Wales, so our first choice had been St Michael's in Cardiff. So that was the first place we looked. But I wasn't allowed to study there at that time. Women could only study for a non-stipendiary ministry, and I was too young for a non-stipendiary ministry. So actually, Queen's was kind of our second choice, and we happened to know other people from the church in Wales who were interested or already studying at Queen's. And I'd been brought up in Birmingham, so very familiar with the Midlands. And also we loved the fact it was an ecumenical college. We loved the fact that we were training alongside Methodists and United Reformed ministers, which gave a richness and a wealth of experience that maybe some of the Anglican-only colleges didn't have.
I know you to be astonishingly full of grace, but it must have been phenomenally challenging to feel a call to ordained ministry within a church context, which at that point was not ordaining women to the priesthood, and at a point where conversations about women's ministry were phenomenally contested. How did that feel like? How did that play out in terms of the development of your vocation at that point, as you were anticipating preparing for ordination to the diaconate?
I don't think it actually did always feel that hard. I think one of the peculiar things for women, and I don't know if my sisters in ministry feel the same thing who are here, but I've always felt that ministry is much more as a gift as a woman, that the fact that it was something that didn't seem to be possible, or that doors were shut and had to be opened up, meant I've always seen ministry as a gift, as something amazing rather than a kind of progression or a career path. It's always seemed a gift. And also, I think I was very fortunate, really, that when it was a time when we had to push for change, that coincided with me being young. And when you're young, you are very idealistic and barriers just don't seem that important. And coming up against things and being part of a movement for change feels very exciting. So I think I was very fortunate that I was in that particular cohort of women. But I also think women of my generation have a wonderful gift in seeing ministry not as something that they have a right to be part of, but I think that understanding that all ministry is a gift maybe comes more easily to women because of that.
There is something there, isn't there, about how you feel you have to justify presence and space. I'm really conscious of how phenomenally well prepared you are for everything, and how careful and kind with arrangements. And I suppose that my amateur psychologist has always wanted to ascribe that to that sense that there is a space where justification is necessary and where entitlement has always been absent. And I think that for minority groups, that's often the case, that there's a preciousness to ground because one didn't always know that one would be allowed to step there.
And doesn't that get right to the heart of the gospel, though? Because, I can talk about women and the struggle for women's ordination, but actually I'm part of an incredibly privileged group of middle class people with access to education, living in a very wealthy part of the world. But the gospel and the story is always about a God who is there for the people who are not included and for the outsiders. And the call to the ministry and a call to discipleship is to be attentive to the people who are on the edges, not to defend the privileged place, but to be opening that up and including others. So, yeah, being a little bit on the edge and having to find a way in, I think is a gift and a blessing, and something that all of us who've ever felt excluded, and anybody who's felt on the outside, we ought to be able to use that as a bit of a springboard for ministry.
It reminds me a bit of our gospel at the Cathedral last Sunday morning, where the man who has been healed after waiting by the pool in Bethesda for 38 years is told by Jesus to take up his mat and walk, and the first reaction of the religious authorities of the Judeans is you're carrying your mat, and it's the Sabbath day, and you're not allowed to do that. You started. You and Andrew started ordained ministry in the Church in Wales in the Diocese of Monmouth, and then moved to the Diocese of St David's, to the alarmingly middle of nowhere land. What was rural ministry in Eglwys Newydd, and that's what you kind of been like back then?
It was fantastic. I mean, we moved because we were the first stipendiary couple in ministry in the church in Wales, and we absolutely had to go wherever people would accept us. And so going to St David's was driven by the fact that there were two parishes that they hadn't been able to fill for a long time because it had been difficult pastoral situations in both of these parishes. But it was a joy to go to parishioners who were willing to receive. I was a deacon at that stage, and we didn't know if I would be priested or when. But they were willing to receive a deacon in charge of their parishes. And they were willing to help teach us Welsh, because our Welsh was very much in its early stages. But to incredible, welcoming people. I was pregnant and learning Welsh, and they just looked at me and said, "Great, we can have a Sunday school." And they were just so accepting and so patient. And rural folk they've got so much to teach us in a way about resilience, because so many rural churches just find ways to be where it seems impossible. And Ceredigion farming folk are great at generosity and hospitality and about dignity as well. It was really important that worship was well done, and in some ways very formal, but very careful. And I learned a lot about the importance of being prepared and the importance of good welcome. I can remember there was one little church, newydd, Hafod, where I would turn up in the morning, and if I so much as sniffed as I got out of my car, by the time I got to church, there would be a glass of water and a tissue at my place. And the church warden would stand at the door at the end of the service, and she quickly realised that I'm rubbish at remembering people's names. So on the way out, she would say, "And of course, Vicar, you remember Mrs. So-and-so," and give me the name. And then when I drove home, if it was an evening service in the dark, another church warden, Tom, would follow me to the end of the forest to make sure that I was safe on the country roads. So that attentiveness and that care, we learnt so much from rural folk in Ceredigion, and I'm so grateful for those years of ministry.
I hope Jane is picking up good warden tips at that point. I could do with the person on my left shoulder who's better with names than I am too. After ministry in St David's, you became chaplain to the Bishop of St Asaph, John Davis. Occasionally, I think that working for the church is something that you need to be comfortable with, kind of watching sausages being made, because it's not always very pleasant on the inside. Although also a huge privilege to be working alongside bishops, supporting them in their ministry. That's only been my experience these last few years. What was that period of ministry like, away from that sustaining life of the parish, but working alongside a very kind, I think, Bishop of St Asaph?
That was wonderful. And it didn't happen straight away. So I was invited first to be a cathedral chaplain. So I'd spent a year in the cathedral. And during that time, the bishop kept asking me to do little tasks that I thought was slightly strange. So he'd appear in the cathedral and wave a letter at me and say, "Oh, could you draft me a response to this, Mary? Or could you arrange this?" I didn't realise it was a kind of 3-month interview of being given little tests. And then he asked me to be his chaplain. I didn't know what a bishop's chaplain was, but if the bishop asks you to do something at that stage, you just say yes, don't you? So I just said yes, not really understanding what the tasks would be. But it was wonderful. It was wonderful because it was with a bishop who was open to doing things differently. So suddenly his bishop staff meeting, which was all men, had a woman in attendance. And the first thing they asked me to do was to write notes for everyone. I was still a bit young and cheeky, so I said to the meeting, "Well, I think I'm supposed to write notes for the bishop, but maybe it's not a good idea to ask the only woman in the room to take notes for everybody. Maybe we should all take turns. And Bishop John was very happy for me to participate as a member of his staff, so to speak at meetings, not just to be the note taker. And he was willing to listen to my sometimes very naive comments, but to create a place where I felt included, and where some of the kind of hierarchical stuff began to get a little bit broken down. And it gave me an insight into some of the pastoral ministry of the bishop. So actually seeing how bishops care for clergy and care for parishes, and to see some of the diversity that when I was in a parish, I was very focused on the parish. But working for a bishop, I began to see care for different parishes, for larger communities, small communities, groups, and to see some of the wider life of the church, how the church in Wales relates to the Church of England and to the wider Anglican Communion. So it was a time to see some of the breadth of the church. And because I was with a generous, kind bishop who had a heart for inclusion, I really felt part of a team and learned a tremendous amount during that time. It was due to his generosity and due maybe to the particular cocktail of people we had on that team.
After that, again, you went to minister in an interesting in-between space as the Anglican chaplain at St Joseph's Catholic and Anglican high school in Wrexham, itself a very distinctive institution. What was it like being the priest for a community of Anglican and Roman Catholic young people there?
Oh, that was amazing. Because it's more Catholic than Anglican. It's a school where the Anglicans essentially bought their way in. So it was a very successful but very poor Catholic school in a place, Wrexham, where they had a substantial bequest to fund statutory education with young people. So the Anglicans had bought a share in the school. But I remember my first day there, I was replacing an Anglican chaplain who'd been a man and who'd been so Catholic in his outlook, the children probably couldn't tell the difference. But I remember walking down the corridor in my dog collar and a little boy running along the corridor, stopping and staring at me and saying, "You're a priest. That's cool." And then just carrying on. I had thought when I first went there, as maybe as a chaplain in a secondary school, maybe I wouldn't wear my dog collar all the time, but I quickly realised actually that was an important place to be wearing my dog collar and to be showing the children a broader picture of what ministry and Christianity and Christian leadership looks like. But the extraordinary thing about that school is they have made worship so important. So the children, the young people there are desperate to be part of worship. It's like the highest honour in that school to be leading one of their liturgies or to be involved in the liturgies. They have curated worship and the staff give such importance to it that the children and young people see its importance. And it is just a spectacular place. You know, if anybody ever tells you that young people aren't interested in religion, going to a school like that just shows you where it's respected and where children are nurtured and listened to. Their spirituality is so strong. All they want is for adults to be real with them, not to be patronising and to speak truths about their faith. And when they do that, it is amazing. So I had 7 incredibly rich years at St Joseph's.
After that, in 2018, you joined us here in the Diocese of Bangor as Archdeacon of Bangor, and at a time of very significant change for the diocese and for the archdeaconry at the end of a process of forming 9 ministry areas out of about 40 parishes previously. Conscious that part of our calling as a cathedral community is to hold the wider diocese in prayer. Give us a sense of the wider archdeaconry beyond the cathedral in Bangor. When you look across the archdeaconry that's been in your care for the past 3.5 years, what does it look like?
It's incredibly diverse. It really is amazing. You know, from Gadeirlan, where there's a great focus on eco-theology, and where you've got small communities led by a priest who is really interested in doing new and green things alongside regular ministry. And then you've got Llun, which is a very strange place in the diocese. It's like in some ways, a much more English enclave, but with a deep kind of Welsh strand there too, and an incredibly beautiful little church up on the Orme. And then you've got all the kind of rural collections of parishes in between, as well as little seaside towns. And we've got some places where it's incredibly Welsh, mewn and Llun, with its very, very Welsh congregations, and Carnarvon. And beginning to understand Cofi Welsh has been a real challenge for me. And then we've got the Brewery, you know, with a massive tourist attraction, but the incredibly diverse communities, very linguistically different, very different in their rurality, or in their focus around towns and villages. Incredibly different churches, incredibly different ministries, different people, and different characters of ministry in each place. And that's just Bangor Archdeaconry, you know. I'm so conscious that there's a whole different world to explore on Ynys-Môn and in Mary as well. We are an incredibly broad and diverse diocese.
As well as your local ministry in all of those places over the course of your ministry, you've also had a very different ministry through your broadcasting and writing and people beyond those communities in Wales where you've been based will have heard you on Prayer for the Day, and a significant amount of Radio Wales broadcasting too, as a guest and as a curator of programmes. What drew you into that broadcasting ministry, and what's it like being a priest, a person of faith, in that space?
I kind of fell into it rather than was drawn into it. Apparently, there are not that many of us who are young sounding and who are willing to do this kind of ministry, and who are female and Anglican, that they are always on the lookout for clergy at the BBC to participate in this work. It's actually quite challenging. You're asked very often to do very short pieces, so the broadcast might only be for 2 minutes, But the work to produce that 2 minutes is often several hours. And with me, I'm incredibly slow. Sometimes it's a whole day writing and rewriting, and you have to be willing to tear up and start again when the producer tells you it's rubbish or it's not right, or it's the tone isn't right or the message isn't right. But what's kept me at it, actually, is having that expertise, having producers who know about communication, willing to invest that much time. That's such incredible training. Because one of the really hard things about ministry, I think, is preaching. Clergy famously think that we're really good at preaching, but actually we get very little training and very little feedback. But when you have an opportunity to work with professionals, and particularly professionals who are willing to be brutally honest, and also to help you, that's an incredible training. So I understand from the BBC they've approached lots of clergy, but they have a high dropout rate because it's hard when you've spent 4 hours writing something to be told, oh, it's not going to be broadcast. But actually, I think it's worth sticking with. And it's amazing to have those kind of conversations. You know, it feeds your academic and intellectual life to have someone tearing apart what you're saying and saying, really? How can you say that? How do you justify that? It's a really good way, I think, of being helped to grow in communication. And it's an ongoing challenge.
An invitation there for us to offer the new bishop robust feedback on her sermon on the fourth Sunday of Lent. Take a step back with me. I'm thinking at the beginning of our conversation, a time of a kind of a moving away from 1950s Church of the Book of Common Prayer to where we are today in terms of a church that lives its life here through ministry areas and a diversity of communities. Looking at from the outside, an uncharitable person would chart a pathway of decline for the church over that period, and even from the inside, it's a time, isn't it, where things which have been familiar to us are no longer going to be sustainable or sustaining in ways in which they were in the past, and that the challenge to change and not to be anxious in the midst of that, but not to be hubristic either. Those challenges very much to the fore as you reflect on the existential life of the church within which you'll become a bishop. How do you feel about its? How do you feel its temperature?
It depends where you look, and it depends where I look. And I'm also kind of being challenged at the moment as well about how I look on the church. Because everything that I've learned in ministry tells me I'm so often wrong about what will survive and what won't. I remember at the beginning of my time in St David's diocese, one of the churches that I was called to look after, Ysbtycan, tiny little rural church with a tiny congregation. And as soon as I went there, that was on my hit list of, well, this church isn't going to survive very much longer. There is no hope here. It's not worth me investing too much energy in this congregation. I'll just do the minimum because I think it's going to die here quite quickly. That church is still going and has an amazing resilience about it. And there is something there that's still alive. There's something about dignity and beauty that where faith is real, there's a dignity and beauty about what people offer and how it's offered. And I kind of think where there's some beauty and some dignity in what's offered, that seems to me to be a sign of life and a sign of hope. We are in difficult times, and I see churches where there is so little beauty to be seen, and where things feel very, very frail, and it's hard to see a future. But where there is energy and where people are still offering faithful integrity in their worship and in their lives beyond church, I do see hope. It's going to be a church that looks different. I've often said during the pandemic, it's been a little bit like those disclosing tablets at the dentist. This time of hardship has shown us where there's resilience. And we've seen, haven't we, churches that haven't reopened or have been very slow to reopen. And so, yes, I see times of change and I see frailty, but I also see beauty and dignity and signs of life, and sometimes in unexpected places and amongst unexpected people.
I got a message from the mitre makers in Rome this afternoon to say that your exciting gold mitre that will live in the cathedral for you to wear when you're with us there is now on its way. The nuns having completed their careful sewing work. And I know as I say that you'll hate that thought. We've added an extra 5 inches to the top of it to make it extra extra big and awful. My last question is, what does it feel like on the edge of going away on retreats to pray and be still ahead of a busy day on Saturday? What does it feel like to be on the threshold of a new chapter in ministry?
Very much like it felt before my ordination to the diaconate. And again, I think women, particularly of my generation who lived through that uncertainty, will know the kind of added extra thrill of that, setting off on a journey where you don't know where it's going to lead. And so there's a real mixture of being at times utterly terrified and at other times thinking, this is really exciting. And yeah, feeling that I'm not alone. Over the past weeks, every day I've had letters and messages of people saying that they're praying for me, and some of them are extraordinary. I've had a number of messages from Roman Catholic women, and the sisters where I'm going wrote to me and said, we want to say congratulations, but we want to say thank you for your courage in doing this. And I had a letter from a friend who left the Anglican Church over the ordination of women to be a Roman Catholic because he couldn't accept women as priests, but who wrote to me saying, I've seen gifts for leadership in you, Mary, and this is good news, and I'm praying for you. How gracious is that? You know, somebody who for whom women's ministry has meant a loss for him, is still able to offer prayer and lovely, kind words, and being surrounded by all that grace and encouragement, that calms the nerves and the anxiety, and pushes me more towards remembering actually Christianity is a joyful journey, and all our callings offer such potential. So yeah, a real mixture.